will be sharing in full or in parts in the future. So if you are not comfortable being recorded, please feel free to turn off your camera. I want to welcome you all to today's discussion, which will be moderated by the esteemed Angela Henry, who I will introduce in just a moment. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Women Creating Change, or WCC, and our work. WCC is dedicated to breaking down barriers to civic engagement, as well as for women, especially women who have been historically excluded from civic life. Through our signature Civic Matters initiative, WCC supports these communities to learn about civic engagement and why it matters. Use action-oriented tools and resources, practice using advocacy skills, and engage directly in advocacy for themselves. Civic Matters is comprised of 4 key elements, including community-based workshops in which women can gather, network, and learn about civic engagement opportunities in a supportive and safe environment. We are actively building out our action-oriented resource hub, which will be a one-stop shop for an individual's civic engagement needs. Eventually, we will round out Civic Matters with a fellowship program and a university-based leadership institute. More to come. I know I speak for all of us at WCC when I say what a great honor it is to host today's budget discussion with a member of Governor Hochul's administration. Today's session will be structured as a Q&A between Angela and Emily Kadar, the Director of Women's Affairs from the Office of Governor Hochul. After that, we will be accepting questions and feedback from the audience. WCC has empowered many women, including myself, to understand that our voice matters. It is great to see more and more women getting a seat at the table with the most recent appointment of our first female governor. The conversation today is about how, through budget priorities, Hochul's administration will elevate the priorities of women. It brings me great joy to introduce today's moderator, lifetime WCC member, Angela Henry. Angela's expertise and support has been integral into our organization's maturing into what it is today. A native New Yorker and daughter of social activists, Angela has been involved in many worthy causes, including the International Women's Health Coalition, the Black Women for Black Girls Initiative, and Sanctuary for Families, just to name a few. So with that being said, again, we're so excited to have you all here today, and I'll turn it over to Angela to introduce our guest of honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. It's a pleasure to be here. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another WCC Civic Engagement event, this one on Governor Hochul's budget and budget priorities. And as Sabrina said, we are so fortunate to have with us Emily Kadar, our Director of Women's Affairs. And I say our because Emily is the epitome of a government official who works for us, the citizens. From her student days at Brandeis University, where she researched civil rights and Black power, to managing advocacy and government affairs for national nonprofits, to her past 2+ years in the governor's office, Emily has devoted herself to getting at the root causes of inequity and injustice and working to help create policies for social justice. Welcome, Emily. We're so pleased you could be with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Angela. That was an incredibly kind introduction, and it's just very touching to hear yourself described that way. So thank
no
you so
pressure.
Much. And thank you. And thank you, Sabrina and Carol and Anita and Anya and everyone at Women Creating Change for having me here today. It's really always an honor and a pleasure to be in community with WCC. I have known some of you for a really long time, and it's just always a joy. So I had originally reached out to Carol because the governor really has been emphasizing to those of us on her team that she wants us in constant communication with folks on the ground, with advocates, with different communities, with different constituencies, talking about what we're doing, but also getting that feedback and hearing from all of you regarding what is most important to you, what you're worried about, what you're excited about. And I thought this would just be such a great group to speak to, in particular because of WCC's focus on civic engagement and the really impactful work that you all do every day. So I just want to, first, I'm going to share my screen. I have a very brief presentation. Okay. Apologies for the non-seamless way I'm doing this. There we go. I wish I was like better at doing this in a crisper way, but anyway. So just for context, this presentation stems from the governor's State of the State address at the beginning of January. Every year, the governor of New York constitutionally gives a State of the State address and issues an executive budget. That budget lays out all of her, I'm very excited to say her, policy priorities for this legislative session, which will run through June. Right now, we are in the midst of hearings around that budget. Also the 30-day amendment process, where we may be making any changes on the basis of those hearings, on the basis of the conversations we're having today. And then after that, starting next week, there will be a 6-week negotiation period between the Assembly and the Senate and the governor's team, my colleagues in the counsel's office and across our team, to negotiate what our budget will look like, culminating at the beginning of April for the final budget for this coming fiscal year. I do just want to note quickly that just because something is not in here doesn't mean that the governor doesn't care about it, doesn't mean that it's not part of her overall plan for the state or something that she isn't interested in, but this is really a description of her priorities and her vision. I'll also just note that this is, there's a corresponding document, a policy book, that's 237 pages. So what I'm going to talk about is like a tiny little grain of everything there, but we'll be able to share both a larger presentation and also, I think, a link to that policy book with the State of the State. But so the governor's first priority was rebuilding our healthcare economy and providing more care for New Yorkers. Obviously, after the epidemic, that was top of mind for her, as it is for so many of us. And in particular, she was concerned about the deficit that we are facing in our healthcare workforce, the fact that we have some really critical shortages of healthcare workers. There's a projection that we may face a shortage of over 39,000 RNs in New York in just 7 years, and that we really, in order to both meet the needs of New Yorkers now, but also prepare for any future pandemics, we need to be building our workforce by about a third. So she's made a significant investment. She's proposing a $10 billion investment in healthcare workers and in support wages for those workers, including bonuses for a number of different categories of healthcare workers. She's also been speaking about the need to increase the training capacity of medical institutions to make it easier for doctors, nurses, other medical professionals to easily relocate and practice in New York, for immigrants to be able to get the training and certification that they need to join the healthcare workforce, and to better retain, not just recruit, but also retain healthcare workers, because we've all been hearing about how folks are understandably very burnt out after the last few years. We know also that there have been significant changes in how we experience healthcare, that we need to be compensating providers for things like telehealth services, because we know that patients are really taking advantage of that, and that telehealth is a really important part of our healthcare landscape now. There's also a significant focus in the governor's agenda on healthcare equity, and what are we doing to make sure that all New Yorkers are able to access the healthcare they need. And so that includes looking at mental health, ensuring that vulnerable seniors, individuals with disabilities are able to maintain their healthcare coverage as they age, expanding access to midwifery services and increasing those reimbursement rates, enhancing suicide prevention in schools. I mean, there's a whole range of things under this healthcare bucket that I could talk about extensively, but you get the idea. I think that that is for the governor the #1 priority after what we've been through the last few years. I'm going to go through the next 2 sections just super quickly because I know that Angela and I want to have a little bit of conversation, but the next piece that she really is focused on is gun violence. Sadly, we have seen firearm homicides increase significantly over the last few years in New York. In 2020, there were 546 deaths in New York by firearm. And the governor, in working in partnership with the mayor, with the legislature, with the city council, is really focused on both how are we addressing crime, addressing violence, both in giving support to law enforcement, but also how are we investing in groups that do prevention and look at the really root causes of crime and violence. And from a women's perspective, I really am concerned about the conversation around domestic violence and gun violence, because I think we tend to sometimes separate them as 2 separate conversations. But just look at the situation that happened with the police officers who were tragically killed in Harlem just a few weeks ago. They were responding to a domestic violence call. And so we cannot talk about gun violence without talking about the larger issues around domestic violence, around poverty, and really investing in community organizations that are going to work in partnership with government and with law enforcement to make our streets safer for all of us. And then finally, and then I'm going to pause so we can have a little back and forth, but the governor is very focused on our economy, and in particular, investing in the people of New York State. So that is means that she is looking at how she can offer tax relief to middle class and working class New Yorkers, to small businesses. She is accelerating a $1.2 billion middle class tax cut, which will affect 6 million New Yorkers. There's a $1 billion property tax rebate that will affect 2 million families. But she's also looking at workforce at all different levels. So that includes better access to apprenticeships, better recruitment of public servants, expanding access to green jobs, to tech jobs, and also launching, and I'm really excited about this one, a Jails to Jobs program, which would try to reduce recidivism and make it easier for individuals who have been incarcerated to enter the workplace, and really trying to emphasize for our parole system, for our corrections system, that there needs to be a concerted, clear focus and a real investment of dollars in programs that support formerly incarcerated people getting employment and getting the training that they need to be successful when they are no longer incarcerated. And so with that, I'm going to pause because I think I went longer than I should have, and allow Angela to take a little breather before we keep going.
That's great, but that's a great background to give us a sense of the governor's priorities. And there's some huge numbers that got thrown around in there. And one of the questions I know people have is how is it determined how much money will go to which priority? I don't buy lottery tickets, but if I did, and if I won really, really big, I think I would go to Governor Hochul and ask, how do I split all of this up? You know, Yolanda Vega doesn't tell you that when you win the lottery big, family members you never heard of and friends you didn't know you had start giving you calls and trying to get their hands into your lottery pot. And I would imagine that it's something similar with the government trying to figure out how to allocate limited funds and also how to allocate savings, because, the same way, yeah, so I win the lottery big, but I've got loans that maybe I have to pay back. I have rent, I have other things. And then I also have to think about the future. So Governor Hochul is also thinking 3 and 5 years down the road, what monies are being spent now that are going to have some effects later down the road. So where does the annual budget actually start? How do they figure out how much to allocate for each priority?
That is a great question, and one that I am rarely asked, but is one of the things that I have learned. Before I was in government, you mentioned that I was on the advocacy side, and I think this has been such an education and understanding the roots of that. So as we start working on this as early as the previous summer. So we started working on the state of the state basically in July and August. And we bring together a ton of ideas from agencies, from advocates, staff. And so it comes from a few different places. One, I think it comes from the governor herself. And what she has learned in her years as an elected official at the local level, at the state level. She has her own values, her own priorities. It also comes from the Department of Budget. So we have a budget office of analysts who are very happy to dive into all these numbers. And I, as like a social justice policy person, is always kind of like, what could that cost? They're the ones that really understand the nitty gritty of the numbers, and they sit there and they really are very diligent about balancing all of these different competing priorities. And sometimes that means that there are hard decisions that are made. I think the pandemic really, when we talk about that $10 billion healthcare investment, I don't know if that would have been made prior without the experience of having gone through this pandemic. So sometimes it's things like that that are impacting it. And I think also just the temperament and the experience of Governor Hochul makes her she is someone whose philosophy of government is more around what you were saying in terms of, it's very important to her to have like those rainy day funds, to have reserves. Right now, we have a lot of federal money coming in from a lot of different places. And I wish we were also getting more. I'll just say that I would really like Congress to pass Build Back Better so we can actually have more money for New York for some of the crucial programs that we need. But we have all this different money coming in, and I think that both the governor and the director of the budget office are very concerned about not spending so much now, and then in future years facing a different financial picture and having to make cuts to programs that would really be lethal to them. So it's a balancing act, and it's one that is honestly sometimes one of the hardest parts about even this job, because if someone sits there and talks to me about a program that I think is really wonderful, sometimes I'm not able to move the levers of government as much as I would like to make that happen. And so it's a very complex puzzle.
Yeah, I'll bet it is. And I'd be interested in having you maybe give us an example if you can. I mean, you are the director of Women's Affairs, so I would imagine that there are programs or initiatives that you would be interested in making sure that that receive funding. And so is it people just sort of lobbying the governor about, their particular interests? I'm from the Department of Labor and I want to do something about high school pathways to careers, or is it somebody from the Justice Department who's interested in reform with this Jails to Jobs program? I need X amount of money for this. Do people actually lobby the governor directly?
Yeah, I mean, people lobby, and when I say lobby, I mean that can look like all sorts of different activities. So sometimes it's a meeting in person or over Zoom with myself, with my colleagues, sometimes with the governor herself. Sometimes it's grassroots lobbying, so it's getting tons of letters and tweets, or we get tons of phone calls. And what you mentioned around the government lobbying, that's actually really interesting because that's another piece of it too. And it looks different there, but you know, it may be that the Office for Prevention of Domestic Violence, which is an office that I work with often, they'll come to us and say, here's 10 ideas of things that we would love to do. They know that all of those 10 ideas may not be possible. Some of them are things they might be able to use with existing dollars. Some are things where they're like, we'll have to hire 2 staff for this. We'll have to hire 4 staff for this. This is something that would be, you know, a grant program that would distribute, you know, $7 million in funding. And so they kind of give us that menu of options, and then we work, and it is advocating. I might say we should really do the $7 million idea. And along the way, I may be overruled, and it's not because it's not important, and it's not because it's not valued, but there's a lot in that pot, and there are some tough decisions that get made. And so that's an example of, you know, especially when it's things like pilot programs, things that are a little experimental, those are sometimes treated differently in the conversation than, say, you know, like family planning grant money, which is something that we've always done and that we're going to continue to do, versus like we're going to do some radical new, try something out. That might be easier to get cut along the way.
Makes sense. I remember back in the day when WCC would go up on a Tuesday up to the Capitol and, you know, do our advocacy and lobbying with various representatives and their aides. So it's good to know that that there's still opportunities for citizens to do that as well. I know you have some other things to share with us, some other slides.
Yeah, I'll try to go through quickly because I'm really loving the opportunity to speak directly with you, Angela. But I do want to just touch on a few other things that we're doing. One is this investment in community. And really, when I say investment in community, I'm talking about infrastructure, I'm talking about transportation. And this is something that I personally, as someone who lives in New York City, who rides the subway every day, who sits in traffic, is something that is very important to me. And so we are, you know, continuing investment in transportation, both for existing projects and some new and exciting projects. So just, you know, I know this is a New York City group. Some of the things that are underway are reconstructing the Bruckner Sheridan interchange at Hunts Point in the Bronx. I'm sure some of you have passed that construction. Modernizing the interchange in Kew Gardens, delivering on the LIRR's third track project, which will make it easier for commuters from Long Island to get into the city and to have access both on the west side to Penn Station and the east side to Grand Central. There's also, again, what I was talking about with the health equity work, there's a focus on how are we talking about transportation in a social justice and equitable way. And so, you know, for decades, we have seen city planning that was either cavalier or even malicious towards communities of color and poor communities. And we have seen communities ripped apart by social planning city planning that concentrated on cars above people. And so some of the attempts to correct some of that include a number of projects upstate, but in the city, there's a plan to cover parts of the Cross Bronx Expressway to reconnect some of those neighborhoods and to create more green space, which I know is sorely needed, particularly in the Bronx. And then what I'm really excited about is the governor has announced this Interborough Express, which is going to be, we're doing an immediate study. We want to really get this off the ground quickly, but using existing freight lines that run from Bay Ridge to Jackson Heights to create a new option. And we're not sure if it will be train, will it be bus? Like they're kind of figuring it out, but a new dedicated option for transportation between Bay Ridge and Jackson Heights, going through Maspeth and Ridgewood, Brownsville, going through all of these different neighborhoods, Canarsie, areas where folks have to just commute for so long to get to jobs. And I think about, if you're a home health aide who lives in Canarsie and all of a sudden you can commute straight to your job in Jackson Heights as a home health aide, I mean, that'll be a game changer for you. And we know that those jobs are not all concentrated in Manhattan. It just doesn't reflect how people work. So I'm really excited about that one. There's also going to be an effort to bring affordable broadband to more people in the state with a $1 billion investment. And so I want to, I realized might be a little out of date. There's also pieces around housing, but I'm going to just skip ahead because we're running out of time.
Okay.
I also wanted to just note the climate change pieces here. The governor just announced last week the creation of the largest offshore wind farm in New York State and off the coast of Long Island. We have some really aggressive climate goals that the governor is focusing on, looking at increasing renewable energy, reducing greenhouse gases. And I think given what we've been through at the federal level for the last few years and the damage that's been done there, and also the continued obstructionism from some members of Congress, it really is going to be up to the states to try to move on the climate. And so I'm really proud that New York is making a major investment in climate change. And I think that will have not just an impact for New Yorkers, but nationally, because we're doing it in tandem with California, with Washington State, with governors from other states to have a real national impact. So with that, I'm going to pause again and we can chat a little more, and then I have one more section after this.
Okay, great. People outside of Albany often think of, state government as someplace out there or some people over there. But you've given us some examples of how state government and state funding actually can affect local communities, at the local level. And certainly New York City, and we get hammered on by the rest of the state, downstate, you take up so many resources and other kinds of things. But it is good to know that that the state is looking at the community level, at a very local kind of level, to use some of their budgeting priorities to improve the lives of citizens, day to day, right here, in the 5 boroughs. So it was good to hear that. You talked a little bit about timing, and there's this sort of informal competition across the country, are the governors going to get their budgets passed on time? And are there things that get in the way of that? Is it that there's new information and so things have to shift? Is it that there are last minute requests? I suppose something like COVID, depending on the timing, if it had started earlier, that would have had a huge effect on the timing of getting the budget passed.
Yeah, that's a great question. The governor takes very seriously her responsibility to get things done on time and sometimes early. She's someone, she likes to show up to places on time. She likes to move. You probably noticed she has a little bit of an Energizer Buddy energy. And I will say that extends to at the staff level. My colleagues here are incredibly committed to getting work done and getting good work done quickly. In terms of the budget being on time, I think the biggest obstacle for that is it's not unilateral. In New York, the governor does just structurally have a lot of power. I would say more so than maybe in other states, even just constitutionally, the way that's set up, the traditions over the years. But the governor does need to negotiate with the houses, with the Senate Majority Leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, with Speaker Carl Hastie. And those two individuals represent a really diverse group of members who, again, all have different priorities, have different pet projects, have different things that they're hearing from their constituents. And so, there's always a little buzz in those final weeks like the final few days before budget of, is this going to happen? Are they going to be able to reach agreement? Sometimes there are sticking points about certain things, and it'll be interesting to see, I think, over the next 6 weeks, what are the major issues that will be more contentious. If, you know, there may be something that the speaker or the majority leader are really committed to, and that's something that they'll work out. Fortunately, I would say that the governor does have a really good relationship with both the speaker and the Senate majority leader. Not every governor has had a good relationship with her counterparts in the houses. So I do hope that that will mean that we will be able to have some constructive conversations. And I do think that it is a new day in Albany in terms of Kathy Hochul is not interested in a kind of iron fist way of ruling. So
Yeah.
I think it'll be interesting to see how it all goes.
Well, Emily, I heard Governor Hochul speak several years ago when she was lieutenant governor, and she was addressing some women college students, many of them first-generation college goers, and she was so passionate about what opportunities lay ahead for them. And as governor, she has mentioned her own experiences as a woman, as a mother, as a spouse, when relating to the everyday lives of New Yorkers. So we'd love to hear about a couple of areas that are near and dear to our audience members, education, childcare, maybe a couple of others in your slides.
Great, yes. So that was a beautiful transition. So education is certainly something that the governor is very focused on. I actually was able to attend a meeting with her even before she took office, in those 2 weeks between the resignation of the previous governor and her being sworn in. One of the first meetings she had was with representatives of the teachers unions, the superintendents, the PTAs, like a real convening of all of these major stakeholders, as well as the heads of the Asian American Federation and representatives of Black and Latino organizations to talk about education issues, safety in schools, masking, all of these different policies, and to have a really robust conversation with all of them. So that is something that is very near and dear to her. So in terms of education priorities, the governor is very focused on how are we supporting our teachers? How are we providing incentives to attract more teachers, to attract more workers in schools in general, because we know that there is a huge amount of different workers that are part of our education system who support teachers and students every day. Also making it easier for teachers to be certified, making it easier for teachers to have a residence in New York, to be able to afford to live in New York, funding a new cohort of the teacher program. And then related to this, certainly not the same issue, but one that we can't really talk about education without talking about it, is childcare. The governor was the former chair of the Childcare Availability Task Force when she was lieutenant governor. And that group put out a report about a year ago with recommendations of how to improve our childcare system and work towards the goal of universal childcare, which is a goal that the governor still has and is something that is deeply important to her. That's an area where that federal money, we still do not have enough right now. I know you all are probably following the conversation around federal funding for childcare. And we're still hopeful that the federal government will be able to provide some more support, because there is just a huge, massive need. But one of the things that we are doing is investing $75 million in wages for childcare workers who do not make enough money for the vital work that they do. We know from childcare providers that they are just having trouble retaining staff because of that. And then we are also trying to increase the number of families who are eligible for subsidized childcare here in New York. So right now, you can receive subsidies if your income is 200% of the federal poverty line. We're increasing that to 225% with a plan to increase that more over time. And that should affect 100,000 families. I think we also have more work to do in just making sure people are aware of all of the different subsidies and different programs that they are eligible for, because I don't know if everyone necessarily knows that kind of complicated landscape around childcare. And I think there's work that we need to do around simplifying access to childcare. We also are doing a lot around equity in general. And this is an area that I actually is heavily in my portfolio. So I'm gonna sort of just like bump up a few things that are projects that I'm heavily involved in. One, the governor announced the creation of the Council on Gender Equity, which will be a group of individuals from around the state, leaders, who will really focus their attention on creating a broad vision for gender equity here in New York, making sure that gender equity, that women and girls, that the needs of all women, including transgender women, are part of every policy conversation that we're having, that will really function as a think tank for the governor. And we'll work also with her cabinet members who are leading agencies. The first charge for that council will be a project around women in work and what are we doing to support women in the workplace. And so that's where that childcare conversation comes in, pay equity comes in, you know, equity and representation everywhere from the board level to how are we making sure that women are have access to flexible work or are not being punished for taking care of their kids or taking care of their parents while simultaneously keeping a job. And so I'm really excited for that work to really begin in earnest, hopefully next month. We've also announced work around investments in the family planning grant program. The governor has also been very committed to ensuring reproductive rights for all. We have a provision in the budget that would codify coverage for abortion in New York State healthcare plans, private healthcare plans in New York State. And the governor also is supporting passing an equal rights amendment this session, which the legislature is very interested in doing.
Thank goodness, thank goodness, it's been too long.
Yes, long, I know, everyone, sometimes I talk to people and they're like, let me tell you a story about when I was on the road in 1982 trying to
It's true, it's
like,
true.
It's long overdue.
It is.
And,
we have
you know,
maybe maybe 1 minute left.
Sorry, go ahead, Angela.
We have maybe
okay,
1
so
minute
I'm going to
left.
close it up. Okay, so I'll just close it up by just saying, finally, that all of this, the governor recognizes that she is in this position because there have been some major flaws in and a breaking of the public trust with state government in particular, with the governor's office in particular. And so the governor is really committed, and she said this from the first speech that she gave, to trying to build public trust in the governor's office, in New York State government, in Albany. We want to get rid of this idea of this dirty, murky culture in Albany. And so some of the things that she has announced include enacting a 2-term limit for governors and for all statewide elected officials, including the attorney general, the comptroller. So people will not be able to just run and just retain power for many years. So you'll have a two 4-year limits, and just making ethics and decency a real part of what it means to serve in New York government, because ultimately we serve the people, we do not serve ourselves. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll release you all for my PowerPoint.
No, it was really great, and thank you in advance for making the packet available to WCC to share with everyone. Here's a question: if we're reducing taxes for middle-income households and increasing funding for the other departments, does it mean that certain programs will be eliminated or receiving less funding? So
there's always a really complicated calculation that gets played. We are in a good position right now with, like I was mentioning, some of that federal money from the American Rescue Plan and some of the other bills that passed at the federal level. So we are not in a position right now where, like we have been in some years, where there was a deficit and we were dealing with some really major tough cuts. That said, there is always different balances. They look at every single program. So I can't say that there aren't going to be programs that have cuts. There, of course, are always cuts and decisions that are made, but we are in a position this year where we are not facing dire circumstances the way that we were even 2-3 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. You touched on this a little bit. During the pandemic, a very large and disproportionate percentage of women dropped out of the workforce, as we know, in part due to issues relating to childcare and remote education. How does Governor Hochul plan to address this issue to help bring more women back into the workforce and address childcare? You did touch a little bit on the childcare issue.
Yeah, in addition to what we were talking about, we're working pretty closely with advocates and with legislators who are also really focused on this. One of the pieces of legislation that was passed last year was the continuation of that child care availability task force that I talked about, that'll be focused on the impact of the pandemic around childcare, how we're better supporting workers, and how federal money is being utilized. So those are kind of the three charges, and we're hoping to have that up and running soon. I will say that there's a lot further to go. What has been proposed in this budget is not universal childcare, and I don't think that anyone is trying to pretend that it is. And we know that that's the ultimate goal. And so I think that working closely with our friends in the houses, working closely with the Office of Children and Family Services, there's more that we need to do. And I expect, we were talking about what's going to be big issues at the negotiating table. I think that may be one of them, that we're going to have a lot of conversations about what more can we do to expand access to childcare.
Excellent. And towards that goal for universal childcare. Michelle asks about the notion that you mentioned about growing and retaining a workforce, but the bonus for healthcare workers is only $3,000 for a year. Wouldn't a real raise increase be a much better investment for the future, especially for home health workers who make minimum wage?
Yeah, I've had this conversation a few times. The decision that was made, and I'll be totally honest, I was not at the table when the decisions were made around the 10. Weirdly, they didn't call me about the $10 billion. But I think that ultimately that was when they were looking at different options around how are we supporting healthcare workers, that was the one that was seen as most doable at this time, with trying to get the most support to the most workers. I recognize that, especially for home workers, those are folks who have been working with really low wages in tough jobs for a very long time. And that those are mostly women, and those are mostly women of color. And so I think that there is more work that we need to do to focus on home workers and recognize the work that they do. And I think with elder care and care for the disabled in general, that's a conversation that we need to be having. It's something that we're continuing to talk about. I don't have a super satisfying answer to the question of why this way and not that way, but it was a decision that was made by the governor and the budget director as the best path forward in this moment in time.
All right, thank you. Is there any exploration of reintroducing the family leave protections that were unfortunately dropped from federal bills?
So with family leave, we've actually made some progress recently. So New York has paid family leave. We've had it for the last few years. It expanded last year, a few months ago, with the passage and signing by Governor Hochul of a bill that now includes in the category of individuals who are considered family for paid family leave and includes siblings, which I was really excited to see, because before it was just, I think, a parent, a child, a spouse, maybe possibly a grandparent, I would have to check. But now siblings are included in that category. So I was really excited when that was expanded. But New York has pretty strong paid family leave protections. We also have really strong paid sick leave. We have strong pregnancy discrimination. We've made a lot of progress over the last few years. And I think part of what the work we need to do, you know, we can always continue trying to expand those things, but I think there's also a lot of education that needs to happen. Particularly, I know, just as someone in the workplace, that you don't always know what's accessible to you. Your employer doesn't always tell you what you have access to. And especially, you know, I'm very concerned around for pregnant individuals. There are people who are at work and they don't know that, you know, you can take paid time off to go to the doctor, or you can get consideration. Your job has to allow you, you know, certain medical accommodations when you're pregnant. And we need to make sure that we're making a concerted effort to reach people in different languages, in different communities, so they know what their rights are, because there may be more protections and programs available to individuals than they may realize.
Yeah, education is always an issue, having people aware of what their rights are. WCC is part of making that happen. A question, hi Phyllis, will there be an increase in funding for school-based health centers and support for their provision of mental health services? Any funding for Medicaid, for example?
That's a great question. I would have to go back and look at that particular program. I don't want to speak out of turn. I do want to, and I would encourage you to also look at some of the things that have been mentioned that are in the larger deck and in the Save the State book. But I will say that there was a lot more conversation around mental health. The governor actually talked about mental health and young people's mental health in her address, which I hadn't remembered hearing before. And I was really happy, because I think that that's one of the impacts of the pandemic that we need to be talking about, and making that investment in school-based health centers, and also in some of the other programs, you know, aftercare programs. I talked to folks at, you know, YWCAs and all of these different great community organizations that work with young people who face some really significant challenges, and have seen the population that they work with really suffer over the last 2 years. And so I can get back to you on exact numbers and where that funding is going, but it's a really good question.
Thank you. And we'll look at the full deck when it comes out. And does the budget for improving post-incarceration employment include funding for in-prison education or skill building programs?
Yes, I believe it does. So this was the whole jail to jobs model is one that was advocated for by a really amazing coalition of groups that work directly with incarcerated people. And so I believe that this is looking at training both in prison and for folks who are recently released. And there's a press release on our website, I think, that talks more in depth about what that's going to look like. But I was just really, you know, where my interests lie, I was very excited that was one that was not only included, but was also a point of focus and brought up in the governor's address as something that is a piece that New York can be proud of, especially knowing that advocates have been talking about that for a really long time. This is not a new idea floating around.
Yeah. As you know, WCC is very involved with helping raise awareness and education of citizens on how they can be civically engaged, and particularly, well, not particularly, but including through the electoral process. And one of our attendees mentions that another part of the governor's budget that will build faith in state government is funding for the new statewide public financing of elections. What is the administration planning to do to increase awareness of the program ahead of the November launch? And how can we as advocates be helpful?
That's a really good question. This is where I'm like, this document is so long. This is another one that I would love to get back to you on. I am assuming, and this is again an assumption, that we would love to partner with you on this. Just going back, thinking as a model, the work that we all did together on the census, on other kinds of community partnership proposals. I think that this is another one that is really vital, like the census was so vital for communities across New York. And I would love to connect you with some of the folks that are working on voting. New York has made so many changes over the last few years to our voting system. It is really a credit to particularly some of the legislators in the state Senate and the state Assembly who championed this. I'm thinking of, Senator Zellner Miri. There were folks who came in and this is like the first thing that they wanted to do. And just having greater access to absentee voting, making it easier to change your affiliation. I think we've made a lot of progress. I know that there's more to do. We're unfortunately hamstrung in some ways by our Constitution, and there are certain institutions that make it hard to move as much as we would like, but I would love to be a conduit to WCC, and as that gets off the ground, think about ways that we could work together on that.
That would be great, because November will be here before we know it. Here's a question.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
first June also. June is like sneaking
June,
up on
right? Exactly. Do you have a sense of when New York State will decide to release additional funds for rental assistance for the many New York families that have not yet caught up with their rent arrears? And especially, there are so many families that are women and with young children.
Yeah, so I know that that's a conversation that's actively happening. If there's anyone who's interested in actually having a more detailed conversation about the emergency rental assistance program, Nisa Alcina, who is the governor's special advisor on pandemic relief, is a really amazing, talented, brilliant lawyer who came in to basically clean up that program as well as the excluded workers fund and figure out how we can get that money out the door quickly. I would love to, whether it's I don't know who asked the question, but if it's through WCC or through another organization, if people are interested, we could set up a conversation around that, and she would have more detailed answers on when that money is moving.
Great. There are lots of wonderful questions, but I do want to ask this one because I know that violence and especially gun violence are important priorities for the governor. Do you have a sense of the administration's view about protocols needed to keep students safe in school and to keep schools open, including views on masking and potential vaccine mandates, but especially if you want to talk about violence in schools and student safety?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second part first, and then we can talk about the masking and the vaccines. On the matter of gun violence, certainly guns in schools is a big piece of what the governor has been focused on. She's working really closely with the mayor on this issue. She's working with the president on this issue. They just did a big event where all of them were speaking really as in one voice around what are we doing to not just address gun violence, deal with people who are perpetuating gun violence, but also how are we preventing guns from getting into New York? Because we know that they are not manufactured here, but they are getting here, that there's clearly an underground economy that is bringing guns in. And so we want to be really looking at this as both a national issue and a state and local issue. I think with young people, this is also where those prevention programs come into play, and not necessarily even programs that talk about guns, but just how are we engaging our young people? How are we making sure that they are being fed, and both, you know, literally and figuratively? How are they engaged in after school programs? How are we really investing in the community-based organizations that know them the best, and giving resources to some of those smaller groups that work on addressing gun violence by engaging with young people who are most vulnerable to taking actions that could just forever impact their own lives and the lives of others. So that's one piece of it. On the COVID safety protocol, so as you know, the governor is very focused on reacting to this ever-changing pandemic in real time. She's briefed on it every single day. She's looking at the numbers every single day. We know that the numbers are going in the right direction. Thankfully, I think we're over the hump of this latest peak. And truly every day she's making those decisions. In terms of mask mandates in schools, that's something that she hears from people all the time. And I think she is committed to assessing that, again, literally every single day. And when she gets to a point where, in talking with Dr. Bassett, our health commissioner, and with the other experts who are in the administration, when they feel that the science has us in the right place, that is a top priority, because she, like I said, she hears from parents and students every day who are trying to balance, how am I making sure that my kids are safe and happy and healthy. But
thank you. That's great. Thank you so much, Emily. This has been wonderful. We will get your contact information, which we'll send out to attendees, along with information not only on the slides that you showed us, but the rest of the slides in the big deck. And I want to turn this over to Carol Wasey, our CEO. Carol, are you there?
I'm there, everybody.
There you are.
I was just waiting a moment to be unmuted. First of all, I just want to thank everybody. Wow. And I know we could go on and on. There were still a lot of questions in the chat that people were eager to ask. And what we'll try to do is really create these forums for having ongoing conversations like this. First of all, Emily, I just want to thank you. It was great. Emily, just so everybody knows, she reached out to us to say, hey, we've issued the budget. We're in the middle of planning. We're about to start negotiating. We really want to hear from groups about what they're feeling about our budget, what they think about our plan. And as Emily said to me, you know, we really want to hear what the big concerns are, so that we're sure we're addressing them, and that we can take them back to the governor and all the leadership as they're making these important decisions for our state. So we appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for reaching out, Emily, and we'll certainly stay in touch with that. Also, Angela, want to thank you for helping to lead us through a complicated discussion that is so important to us. And I think part of it, and part of, I think, our job at WCC is to help decipher some of these things. How do we really sort our way through these very complex processes that have evolved over time? And that is a real challenge, and just something I see as an important role that we can play. And Sabrina is our financial leader internally at WCC. You did a great kickoff, and it's great to have people get to know you. For those of you who don't know, Sabrina also happens to be at Amalgamated Bank, who's also been a great partner to WCC and so many across our city as well. So Sabrina, thanks for kicking us off. I also want to thank this great Women Creating Change family, all of you new friends, longtime friends who are participating in this conversation. Thanks to those of you who asked questions. Those of you who didn't get your questions answered, we'll try to find other creative ways to do that. I also want to thank the many board members who also participated. And as I said, our goal is really about engaging, finding really creative ways and opportunities to create these conversations so that it really is a two-way. Emily, it's very brave sometimes to go into these situations, because you never know what you're going to get. And you were totally open to us in being able to have these conversations. And as I said, it will be a part of an ongoing process. And just so everybody knows, we won't do it this week because we know we're heading into a holiday weekend. But next week we will send a follow-up. We'll send this recording along with the full deck. We'll share some of the connections Emily's offered to share her email if anyone has any questions, wants to follow up on anything specifically, and some of her colleagues that were mentioned. We'll include all of that information in the follow-up note. And our goal is always, look, we're a small team at WCC, but with this larger family, we really want to sort of spread our wings and make sure that the governor, as she and her whole team, and I love saying she too, we don't get enough of that in so many ways, so that she really has all the information upon which she can make good, solid decisions. And so thank you all for participating with us today, and we'll be in touch next week with additional materials and more conversations to come. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.